Well, good morning, everybody. So good to be with you again. Special welcome to those of you who are with us maybe for the second time after joining us on Christmas Eve services. So appreciate your presence with us this morning. Like my Pastor Scott said, today we're going to begin a new series in the book of Proverbs, and I've been asked the question, why? Why study Proverbs? The answer is simple, because life is hard. Life can be really, really challenging. There's interpersonal conflict that we experience day in and day out. There are both big and small annoyances that come into our lives. And sometimes we are our own worst enemies. Why would we want to bring more of that into our everyday existence? In a word, wisdom. Wisdom is skill in living life. We think of people who are skilled athletes or skilled musicians. But have you ever thought of someone being skilled in life? In other words, you observe how they are, how they carry themselves. The fact that they don't seem to have as much drama enter into their own lives as a result of their own misguided actions. And you look at that person, you say they are skilled in living life. In a word, that is wisdom. Wisdom is skill in living life the way God intended it to be lived. And essentially all of Proverbs, and by the way, the word proverb literally means comparison. That's why, as you read through the book, you'll understand that two paths in life are being compared constantly. And there are only two. There is the path of the fool and the path of the wise. And each one has its own predictable trajectory. It's like we know the end game. The ultimate test of any worldview is its livability. And I'm going to give you an example of that here in a few minutes. Proverbs means comparison. Two paths in life. The way of the fool and the way of the wise. Additionally, this book has a very warm and tender tone because it comes from the heart of a father to his son. And essentially what the father is saying, son, I care about you enough to give you instruction. I want life to go well for you. I want you to experience human flourishing. Therefore, pay attention. It's written specifically for young adults, for teenagers, but not exclusively. It's also for those who perhaps were raised in a home where you didn't receive godly instruction. Maybe you had the presence of a dad, but you didn't have the godly counsel of a wise father. This is why the psalmist writes and says, God is a father to the fatherless. So here's the deal. If you've grown up in that home, you no longer have that excuse for the way your life is headed. You follow what I'm saying? You no longer have that excuse because what you have in your hands is a collection of truths by which, if you employ them, if you engage with them, your life will be different tomorrow. And what happens is you end up living the kind of life that you've always wanted to live. In a word, that is wisdom and is desperately, desperately needed in our time. If you open up your Bibles, about halfway through, maybe a little to the right, and you'll come to the book. And it starts in the best way possible without any proverb. The opening lines contain no proverbs. It's just one statement after another because it's setting the tone for what you're about to receive. And there's no better place to start than in this way. Proverbs chapter 1, verse 1. It's the Proverbs of Solomon. Now, Solomon lived 3,000 years ago, as the next phrase indicates. He's the son of King David. Solomon himself would be a king, technically fourth king in the line of the Israelite nation. Very, very wise man. And he was given his wisdom by God because in his humility, as he stepped into this role of leadership, and if you assume any kind of leadership in life, you realize it's a very heavy responsibility. And so in humility, he responds to God's request. What would you like from me? Give me anything. As you step into this role leading the people, what is it that you want from me? And he could have asked for a lot of things God would have granted him. But he begins with, I'm a child. I don't know how to go in or how to come out. And some commentators have rightly noted this is the language that's used of a child learning how to go to the bathroom. You follow? In other words, what he's saying is, he's like, I have this huge responsibility, but I'm like this child. And what's the beauty about children is they're innocent. They're also naive in the sense that they don't have a proper understanding of how the world works. And so of all the things that he could ask for, he says, give me wisdom. Which also shows an appreciation for the role that he's in and the responsibility of leading the people of God. I'm like a toddler. I'm not yet potty trained, and yet I have this massive responsibility. Will you give me what I need? And that is wisdom. And God grants him wisdom. And we learn that because of this wisdom imparted by God, there are people from other parts of the planet that actually pay Solomon a visit because he is known for his wisdom. The Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel, to know wisdom and instruction. What is instruction? Think of instruction as the word guidance. To understand words of insight. To receive instruction, guidance in wise dealing. Guidance in righteousness, which is a word that means doing right deeds. Guidance in justice. Guidance in equity. To give prudence, which means common sense, to the simple. As we're going to see, there are two kinds of fools in life. There is the naive who simply lacks the knowledge, but then there are those fools who say, I have nothing to learn. I know everything. That's the worst kind of fool. Prudence, common sense to the simple, knowledge and discretion to the youth. You see, there it is. If you're in the crowd and you're young, this is most specifically for you because the decisions you're making now will determine the course of your life. Let the wise hear and increase in learning. Even if you believe that you're wise, there is still more wisdom to be gained. And the one who understands will obtain guidance. To understand a proverb and a saying, the words of the wise and their riddles. So the purpose of this book is to give you the skills to live a well-ordered, purposeful, and meaningful life. So I'm going to begin with a very basic definition of what wisdom is. And when I set this up, I'm going to prove to you the power of this definition by virtue of what the text itself says. Here we go. Wisdom is the proper response to the way in which God has designed the world. Let me say it again. Wisdom is the proper response to the way in which God has designed the world. Here's what I mean by that. God is the author, creator, and sustainer of all life. Therefore, he knows how life is to be lived best. It's his blueprint, his plan. If you want to understand the purpose of any created thing, go back to its creator and designer and ask questions. Now, can you live life apart from God's intended order and creation? Yeah, you can, but it's not going to go well for you. And this is the reason why so many of us have such a struggle in life. It's like we constantly beat our heads against it. And we're like, why is my life so jacked up? It's because we're not living according to the purpose God has for us, according to the way in which he has designed the world. And this includes the moral framework that he has embedded into the reality of our existence. Wisdom is the proper response, I can't emphasize this enough, is the proper response to the way in which God has designed the world. Can you live apart from the wisdom of God? Yes, you can. But it's kind of like this. You can crack an egg with a 10-pound sledgehammer. It wasn't created to do that. You can do that. It's going to be very messy for you. But yes, you can live your life that way. In a discongruent fashion with God's intended order. Yes, you can do that. But it will not lead to human flourishing. Every time it will not lead to human flourishing. This is where wisdom comes into play and helps us reorganize our lives around the way things actually are. Wisdom is the proper response to how the world works. Therefore, in order to gain wisdom, one must understand who God is. You must understand who God is in order to be wise. In order to live life successfully, it cannot be done apart from a proper understanding of the one who creates, sustains everything. This is why the opening lines of Proverbs, Solomon does not lay down one proverb. It's statement after statement that essentially culminates in verse 7, which says this: the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. What does that mean? There are two senses of fear spoken of in the Bible. One sense is this: I'm frightened that something terrible is going to happen to me. That's not the sense of fear being communicated in verse 7. There is another sense. Fear in the sense of reverence and awe at the majesty and splendor of God. It's like being in the presence of ultimate greatness and you are brought low simply by being in the presence of greatness. The prophet Isaiah gets this vision of God, and he literally says, I was brought low. It's humanity in the presence of divinity, and he's brought low. He's just drawn to his knees. And then he says, I looked and I saw the train of God's robe, and it filled the temple. Now, back in the day, the length of one's train directly corresponded to the amount of power and authority that one had. And Isaiah says, the train of God's robe fills the temple. See, that's a statement about the majesty and splendor of God. And so the beginning of knowledge is to fear the Lord. It is to understand who God is and his greatness. And in Romans chapter 1, Paul says that we know God exists because of the splendor of nature. I was up in the mountains a few days ago. And when you're away from the city lights and you look up at the night sky and you're like, wow. You know, just the grandeur of it and the finiteness of man, it just brings you low in your spirit. It just brings you low in the sense that you do get a sense that you are in the presence of something far greater than yourself. And Solomon says, that's it. You will never be wise unless you understand that wisdom comes from the author, creator, and sustainer of all life. It's a beautiful, beautiful beginning, beautiful introduction. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. To see God who he is, high, exalted, and powerful, and yet so near. By the way, if you were here on Christmas Eve, you saw this. Because of the word incarnation, God comes in the flesh and dwells among us, and we see his compassion, his tenderness, his grace, and his mercy. And this is what it means to begin to understand and become wise. Now, there is a sense in which if you disregard God, then you will reap what you sow. This is something to be feared. It's not as if God is waiting to punish you for the wrongdoing that you do every moment of your life, but because God has baked these things into the fabric of reality, if you go against them, you will reap what you sow. And in that sense, unwanted things will certainly come into your life if you ignore God's wisdom. So now we understand why King David writes this in Psalm 14. It is the fool who says in his heart, what? What does the fool say? What does the fool say? There is no God. I believe that Friedrich Nietzsche was one of the most influential philosophers of all time, not for the reason you might think, but for this reason. He famously wrote, God is dead. We have killed him. And it was as if to say, we are now in the age of enlightenment. With modern man's ability to use his brain and think rationally, we don't need God. All of a sudden, I think, therefore I am. What Descartes started, Nietzsche threw gas upon. Man's mind was suddenly elevated to the center of reality. We don't need God in order to understand how things are. We have the modern mindset. God is dead. We have killed him. Okay? The reason why Nietzsche is so significant in the world of philosophy is because the ultimate test of any worldview is its livability. Nietzsche was one of those few philosophers who actually lived his worldview. So you get to see the outworking, you get a front row seat, you get to see the trajectory of one's life who says, we don't need God. Now there is a moral vacuum to be replaced by man. We will decide what is right and what is wrong. We will determine this for ourselves. By the way, this is in part why our society is where it is. Don't think that early philosophers don't have influence. We are no longer in a modern mindset, but we are in a postmodern mindset where we no longer think, therefore we are. We are postmodern. We've moved beyond that. I feel, therefore I am. It's not even about rational thought anymore. It's about how you feel. It's a further drift away from God's embedded design of reality. And so many biographers have rightly noted that Nietzsche began life as a seminary student, but he succumbed to his vices. One in particular, a fondness for prostitutes. Fast forward to the end of his life, and his doctor, very well-known doctor of the day, diagnosed him with mental illness brought on by untreated syphilis. Because you know what syphilis does, right? It affects the blood vessels to the spine. Nietzsche was immobilized. It affects the flow of blood to the brain. Nietzsche went mad. And in fact, his later writings are literally referred to as the writings of madness. You can crack an egg with a 10-pound sledgehammer. You follow what I'm saying? But it's not going to go well for you. So now, especially those of you who are younger, now you're beginning to understand why your life is unwound. Because we've lived it apart from God's intended design for all things, including you. Isn't it interesting? For these reasons, oh, by the way, let me say this. There is a difference between intelligence and wisdom. Wisdom is not intelligence. These are two very different things. Intelligent people can be very foolish. Wisdom does not exclude intelligence, but it is not its focus. Again, for this reason also, Solomon encourages us to look at lesser things of nature and learn from them. For example, Proverbs chapter 30, verse 24. 4 things on earth are small, but they are exceedingly wise. The ants are a people not strong, yet they provide their food in the summer. When do you find ants in your backyard here in the valley? Not now, but you find them in the summer. Why? Because it's too cold in the winter for ants to forage food. That's why they go out in the summertime and they start building ant hills and they start foraging like crazy in the summer. Why? Because the ants love the heat. And there's all kinds of food out there for foraging. And so what Solomon is saying, you want to be wise? Look at the simple ant who is functioning according to his design within the framework of how God created the world, specifically referring to the seasons. The ant is wise enough to know it's hot outside. Time to gather food, everybody, because it's going to be cold again. That's wisdom, planning ahead. The simple ant can learn. Why? But what is it about it, the ant, The ant is functioning according to God's design and intention and purpose as it exists in the reality of God's world. The rock badgers are a people not mighty, yet they make their homes in the cliffs. When you think of power, you don't think, you know what's powerful? A rock badger. You don't say that, and yet they're considered powerful in that God has created them in such a way as to be able to make their homes in places where their enemies cannot reach them. And they do so. Learn from them. The locusts have no king, yet all of them march in rank. I went down the locust rabbit hole this week. I was like, what does this mean? I nerded out on this. Here's what I would tell you. The Bible is not a book about insects. But this was written 3,000 years ago. And lo and behold, you know what I discovered? Locusts have no hierarchy, just like the text says. Isn't that interesting? Bees do. Bees do. But it doesn't say that bees have no hierarchy. Why? Because that wouldn't be accurate. Why? Because if the Bible comes to us from God, every word of it is truth. So the Bible is not a book about insects, but when it speaks about insects, it's going to be accurate. You follow what I'm saying? So the locusts have no hierarchy. Did you know that? They're independent creatures. You're like, well, what about when they swarm together? They swarm together essentially because of overpopulation. And so what, and even in their movement, you know how they move? You're like, wow, who's the band leader there? That's sophisticated. They don't have one. Each individual locust moves according to its proximity to the locust next to it. They have no leader. That's why you see it going like this and like this, going crazy. There's no leader. It's totally random because they're only responding to the individual locust next to it. So what do the scriptures say? Man, this is I could go off on this, man. I'm so tempted to, because the Bible is not a book about science, but the Bible talks about the sphere of the earth in a day when the predominant scientist said it was what? Flat. God sits above the vault of the earth, sphere. The locusts have no king, yet all of them march in rank. Locusts don't struggle with who desires to be the leader, who wants to be the most popular. No, they cooperate with each other, and as a result, you will know their presence. The lizard you can take in your hands, yet it is in king's palaces. So lizards were depicted in ancient times as being of the lowliest creatures because you can catch it with your hand. And yet, it can exist in a place where the living standards are the highest. Why? It's just doing what lizards do, They creep into little spaces and they find the comfortable spot, and it's just all by design. These animals do not have high IQ. They are not figuring out how to take over the world. The Planet of the Apes is just a movie, by the way. These creatures recognize, here's the point, I can't emphasize this enough. These creatures recognize and respond to the way in which God has designed the world. But verse 7 doesn't end with the fear of the Lord. It adds this: fools despise wisdom and instruction. To despise something is to have a strong dislike for it. If you dislike wisdom, you are your own worst enemy. This is why your life is undone. This is why you're unhappy, you're unsettled. This is the source of much anxiety and stress in your life. That's why I began by saying, why study Proverbs? Well, let me ask you this. Why do you want to bring more drama in your life? Solomon describes a fool in this way, verse 18. But these men lie in wait for their own blood. They set an ambush for their own lives. In other words, the fool suffers at his own hands. But it's not just his own suffering. We'll look at a few of these examples here in a moment. But let's recognize that in Proverbs, the fool and the wise man are contrasted over and over again. A few examples of this. Proverbs 12, the way of a fool is right in his own eyes, but a wise man, see the contrast? But a wise man listens to advice. Proverbs 28, whoever trusts in his own mind is a fool, but he who walks in wisdom will be delivered. Two kinds of fools I mentioned earlier. There is the naive fool. He's the simple fool. This is a person who realizes, I'm a fool in the sense that I lack instruction. You seem to have it. Share it with me. Share it with me. I don't want to be a naive fool. I don't want to be the simple. you have what I need, and I'm humble enough to receive it from you. Give it to me. That's the naive fool. Then there is the fool who will not listen. He is his own worst enemy. And even when counsel is given, the fool says, I don't need it. I will trust in my own wisdom. And when you trust in your own flawed understanding, there's where the heartache and humiliation comes into your life. A common outworking of this appears in our own culture, our more modern times, when people are allowing themselves to be led by their feelings, and then you begin to adopt a lifestyle that is completely and totally apart from the things of God. Foolishness is never self-contained. It affects those around us. Perhaps you've grown up in the home with a fool or two. Proverbs 13, the companion of fools will suffer harm. Relationships have a powerful influence. This is why, in large part, Solomon writes to his young son. And if you're a parent, you know this to be true. When your kids are little, man, it's like you walk on water, you know? And then they get to be teenagers, and you basically walk and live in quicksand. And what's really frightening is the voice of their peers becomes very influential. And so Solomon says to his son, you become the company you keep. Choose your friends wisely. The companion of fools will suffer harm. If you surround yourself by people who reject wisdom, it's not going to go well for you. We start thinking and acting and talking like people around us. Proverbs 18, a fool's lips walk into a fight, and his mouth invites a beating. Reckless words bring violence, son. Alternatively, consider this, Proverbs 17, even a fool who keeps silent is considered wise. When he closes his lips, he is deemed intelligent. A fool often reveals his or her nature through careless words. This is a maxim that means it's better to be wise and be silent than to speak and reveal your foolishness. Additionally, a fool continues to repeat his mistakes. Here's a graphic one for you, Proverbs 26:11, like a dog that returns to his vomit is a fool who repeats his folly. Fools fail to learn from the mistakes they've made in the past. Let's talk about relationships. How much trust is undermined when we act apart from wisdom? Proverbs 29, a fool gives full vent to his spirit, but a wise man quietly holds back. I'll tell you, this has been really helpful for me because there are so many proverbs that speak to emotional intelligence. We're going to pick some of these apart in coming weeks. Just the wisdom that Solomon drops when he says, emotional intelligence, son. Know that if you respond this way, God has created the world in such a way that in response, you will receive this. Proverbs 3, the wise will inherit honor, but fools get disgrace. This is really crazy. When there is a persistent pattern of ignoring wisdom, it actually leads you to a life wherein you end it with folly. The simple are killed by their turning away, and the complacency of fools destroys them. Proverbs 1:32. We'll close with this. Specific intended audience found in verse 8. Hear, my son, your father's instruction. Don't forsake your mother's teaching. Both parents are involved. For they are a graceful garland for your head and pendants for your neck. Proverbs is for everyone, but it is most specifically for young men. So let me speak to the young men for a moment. 2 words. Pay attention. Pay attention. If you want a well-ordered, meaningful life, if you want the life you have always wanted, receive godly instruction. Don't be the kind of fool who says, I know it all, I have nothing to learn. Why? Because I'm 18. We laugh, but we have all been there. And the worst kind of fool is the one who has played the fool his or her whole life and ends up in disgrace. A graceful garland for your head and pendants for your neck. Well, we're off to a good start. I'm going to have you bow your heads and close your eyes because for some in the room, This requires time of contemplation for all of us. The beginning of knowledge is the fear of the Lord. Do you know the Lord? Do you know God? If you don't, you need to. Where does that begin? Begins with a simple prayer. What is prayer? It's communicating with God. Prayer is having a conversation. Communication is one of the pillars of any healthy relationship. And this is how it begins, with the acknowledgement that you depend on God for your very life. That's the starting point. Additionally, with the acknowledgement that by nature, all of us are fools. We want to have nothing to do with God. And in a word, the Bible defines that as sin. And sin is what separates us from the God who created us. God is just. He cannot allow all the wrongs we do to go unpunished. This is why he sent Jesus to the earth to absorb on himself all the wrongs that we've done. The scriptures say God made him, Jesus, who knew no sin, to be sin on our behalf. The motivation is love. John 3:16, for God so loved the world. God never created a person that he did not love deeply, including you. I think there's no better way to start the new year than by remembering what Jesus did for us on the cross. As we enter into this time of communion and reflection, we're going to do it a little bit differently. Chamberlain is going to sing a song. And as she does, at some point during this song, as the Spirit of God leads you, you participate in the communion elements, and then she will dismiss us at the end. I won't come back up here to lead us through this. This is just business between you and God as the Spirit of God leads you. Let this day mark the beginning of your testimony, your desire to want to walk in wisdom and influence others in wisdom, beginning with yourself and then those under your roof and whatever sphere of influence you might have. And I promise you, because the promise is in the scripture, when you live your life with the wisdom of Jesus, you will experience God's favor on your life. And that is what every person was created and designed for. So, Father, as we enter into this time, our deepest prayer is that you would quicken our minds and our hearts, and that we would be drawn close to you. God, I pray for those in the room who are acknowledging you for the first time. God, I ask that you would be near as you are. Be near to them. I pray that as a church family, collectively, we would go to a higher place, a place that is closer to your heart, with a greater burden, a greater sense of purpose to expand your kingdom. And it doesn't happen without a proper understanding of who you are and what you want for our lives. God, we're grateful for the gift of Jesus. Minister to every heart in the room now, we pray, and we surrender it all to you for your glory, because when your glory is made known and manifested, we are blessed. All for you we pray in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ, and God's people said, amen.